Think about why we're fascinated by history. All those outstanding individuals and exotic peoples, the rise and fall of civilizations, and wondering why that happens. How did the classical Greeks achieve their golden age, the age of Pericles and Socrates, Euripides and Hippocrates? What explains the remarkable confluence of so many outstanding individuals in one cultural era? Jumping ahead almost 2 millennia, why did the Italian Renaissance happen? Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Michelangelo, Raphael. Again, an outpouring of genius in the arts, sciences, and politics. Jumping ahead another 3 centuries, why did the Industrial Revolution happen with its awesome outpouring of productivity? The classical Chinese and the ancient Romans achieved impressive things technologically, but nothing on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. And why did the Industrial Revolution first take root in England and Scotland? Why not, say, in Burma or Botswana? Or what, by contrast, explains major historical declines? Why did the Roman Empire collapse? The most powerful military empire of the ancient world imploded and became defenseless before successive waves of barbarian invasions. And before the Romans, the powerful military empires of the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians also failed. Is there a common pattern at work here? Why did the French Revolution go so horribly wrong, descending into a reign of paranoia, fratricide, and terror? And why, by contrast, did the American Revolution, in many ways fighting the same kinds of battles and subject to the same desperate pressures, not go that self-destructive route? And how, a century and a half later, could the most educated nation in Europe become a Nazi dictatorship? All these questions raise issues of dramatic historic change, for better or worse. But we can also ask questions about the long stretches of time during which no significant changes take place at all. Consider, for example, the San people of the Kalahari area in southern Africa. Sometimes they're called the Bushmen. Experts estimate that for 10,000 years, the San people have existed in essentially the same way, generation after generation. Now let's put that in perspective. If a generation is 25 years or so, then 10,000 years means 400 generations of sameness. By contrast, it has only been about 20 generations since Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And consider how dramatic the changes have been in Europe and America since then. But even the 10,000 years of the San people is dwarfed by the estimated 35,000 years that the Aborigines of Australia have existed essentially the same way, generation after generation. 35,000 years ago is roughly when Neanderthal man was going extinct. Why did the cultures of the San people and the Aborigines not change for such unimaginably long stretches of time? Fascinating questions. I'm a philosopher and intellectual historian by profession, and it is my great fortune to make a living raising and thinking about questions like these. As historians, we study interesting individuals and cultures to learn how they lived, why they lived the way they lived, and what impact they had on the course of human events. As philosophers, we think more broadly and abstractly. We learn our lessons from the historians and ask, are there broader explanations about the dramatic rises and falls of some cultures, or from the static nature of others? History, from this perspective, is a huge laboratory of experiments in human living. Some of those experiments have been wildly successful. Others have led to middling results, leading their cultures to eke out an existence across the generations. And some have been outright disasters, leading to misery and death on a large scale. Can we identify the fundamental causes at work here? Can we learn why some cultures flourish, while others stagnate, collapse, or descend into horror? Is there a moral to the story of history? Let's start with one major historical experiment, one that turned out to be one of the darkest eras in human history. How could Nazism happen? Important question. Professors and teachers the world over used the Nazis as a prime example of evil, and rightly so. The Nazis were enormously destructive in their 12-year regime, killing 20 million people. They were not the most destructive regime of the 20th century. Joseph Stalin and the communist dictators in the Soviet Union killed 60 million. Mao Zedong and the communists in China killed 35 million. The Nazis killed 20 million people, and they undoubtedly would have killed millions more had they not been defeated. So it is important to learn the lesson here and to get it right. After coming to power in 1933 by democratic and constitutional means, the Nazis quickly turned Germany into a dictatorship. For 6 years they prepared for war, which began in 1939. And during a horrific world war in which every human and economic resource was needed for military purposes, the Nazis devoted huge amounts of resources to an attempt to exterminate the Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and others. But what exactly is the lesson of history here? How could a civilized European nation plunge itself and the world into such horror? A common explanation is that the Germans lost World War I. They were bitter over the loss and the harsh punitive measures imposed by the victors in the Versailles Treaty. There's a grain of truth here, but I think this is a weak explanation. One reason why it's weak is that many countries lose bitter wars, but they don't respond to the loss by electing Adolf Hitlers to power. Another reason why it's weak is that Germany's losing World War I does not explain Italy. In 1922, Italy turned to Benito Mussolini and his fascist version of National Socialism. But Italy was on the winning side in World War I. So if one of the winners of World War I turns to fascism, and one of the losers of World War I also turns to fascism, then whether you were a winner or a loser in the war is not the decisive factor here. Another explanation suggests that Germany's economic troubles in the 1920s were the primary cause of National Socialism. Here again there's a grain of truth, but again I think this is a weak explanation. Many countries suffer from economic troubles, but very few of them turn to National Socialism for the solution. There's also the phenomenon of Nazi and neo-Nazi movements throughout the 20th century in the relatively prosperous nations of the world. Very few countries suffering from economic troubles go Nazi, and there are plenty of Nazi sympathizers in the wealthy nations of the world. Another weak explanation suggests that there is something innately wrong with Germans, that history shows that they are inherently militaristic, bloodthirsty, genocidal, and that the Nazis merely tapped into an exaggerated, innate German tendencies. This kind of explanation is, of course, an insult to the millions upon millions of Germans who were appalled by National Socialism and who fought vigorously against it. It also does not explain how Nazism has been attractive to people of many races and ethnicities. In 2005, I was surprised to read that Hitler's Mein Kampf was a bestseller in the country of Turkey. Do we want to suggest that the Turks are inherently bloodthirsty and genocidal? I don't think so. Another weak explanation holds that Nazism is explained in terms of the personal neuroses and psychoses of the leadership. On this argument, Adolf Hitler was, for example, bitterly disappointed at being rejected for art school, or that he was a repressed homosexual, or that his right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, was compensating for his below-average height or having a club foot. To all these explanations, I say, oh, come on. How many art school rejects turn to National Socialism? How many repressed homosexuals or handicapped men become Nazis? This explanation also ignores the rather large number of very powerful Nazis who were neither handicapped nor homosexual nor particularly interested in art. Any of the above explanations can work together with the suggestion that the Nazis were a product of modern communications technologies. That as masters of rhetoric and propaganda, they succeeded in fooling millions of Germans about their agenda and manipulated their way into power. I have some sympathy for this way of thinking, for I think it's the kind of explanation that comes naturally to those of us raised in Western liberal democracies. I know that when I first started learning about the Nazis, I found it hard to imagine them as anything but insane. How could Nazism be anything but the product of deranged minds manipulating the masses? But I want to suggest two reasons why I think it's not a good idea to dismiss the Nazis as mere manipulators, insane or not. The first reason is that the Nazis came to power by democratic and constitutional methods. When the party was formed in 1920, it was a small fringe party. But it spoke to the beliefs and aspirations of millions of Germans. And Germany was, in the 1920s, arguably the most educated nation in the world, with the highest levels of literacy, most number of years of schooling on average, newspaper readership, political awareness, and so on. It was in an educated nation that the Nazis came to power. Now, millions of voters in a democracy may be wrong, but it's hard to argue that they were deluded. A better explanation, I think, is that they knew what they were voting for and thought that the Nazis represented the best hope for Germany's future. But millions of voters in a democracy don't decide spontaneously to vote for this party or that. A mass political movement requires that much cultural groundwork be done over the course of many years. And this is where intellectuals do their work. Intellectuals develop a culture's ideals, its hopes, its aspirations, in books, magazines, sermons, radio broadcasts. It's intellectuals who are a culture's opinion shapers. It's intellectuals who write the opinion pieces for the mass newspapers, who are the professors at the universities where the next generation of teachers and preachers and politicians and lawyers and physicians are all getting their educations. And this leads me to the other reason why I think it's a weak explanation to say that the Nazis were simply deranged and lucked or manipulated their way into power. Consider the following list of intellectuals who supported the Nazis long before the Nazis came to power. The list represents a veritable who's who list of powerful minds and cultural leaders. Gerhard Hauptmann, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1912. Hauptmann once met Adolf Hitler and described their brief handshake as the greatest moment of his life. Philippe Lenard, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1905. Johannes Stark, also winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1919. That's 3 Nobel Prize winners. Then there is Dr. Oswald Spengler, author of the historical bestseller The Decline of the West. Spengler's books sold in the millions, and during the 1920s, he was perhaps Germany's most famous intellectual. Then there is Müller Vandenbroek, another famous public intellectual of the 1920s. His book, The Third Reich, published in 1923, provided a theoretical rationale for National Socialism, and his book, like Spengler's books, was a consistent bestseller throughout the 1920s. Then there's Dr. Carl Schmitt, probably the sharpest legal and political mind of his generation. Schmitt's books are still widely read and discussed by political theoreticians of all stripes and are considered 20th century classics. And to round out this initial list, there is philosopher Martin Heidegger. Already in the 1920s, Heidegger was being hailed as the brightest philosophical mind of his generation. And that is saying a lot in a philosophical nation such as Germany. And that assessment has held over the course of the 20th century. Ask professional philosophers of today to identify, say, the 5 most influential philosophers of the 20th century, and, whether they love him or loathe him, most will name Heidegger. These 7 men are some of the most powerful and intelligent minds in Germany in the decade before the Nazis came to power. They are leading figures in Germany's intellectual culture, spanning arts, sciences, politics, history, law, philosophy, and all of them to one degree or another supported National Socialism. Was Hitler smart enough to fool all of these highly intelligent men? Or is it more likely that they knew what they believed and they supported National Socialism because they thought it was true? So I want to suggest a better explanation. Here it is. The primary cause of Nazism lies in philosophy, not economics, not psychology, not even politics, philosophy. National Socialism was first a philosophy of life believed and advocated by highly intelligent men and women. Professors, public intellectuals, Nobel Prize winners, powerful minds working at the cutting edges of their disciplines. It was they who shaped the intellectual culture of Germany in the 1920s and who convinced millions of Germans that National Socialism was the best hope for Germany's future. This is not to say that there weren't other contributing factors. The legacy of World War I, persistent economic troubles, the personal psychologies of the Nazi leadership all played a role. But the most significant role was played by an abstract set of philosophical ideas. National Socialism was a philosophy-intensive movement. Now maybe you're thinking, here's this Stephen Hicks guy, that's me, who's a philosopher suggesting that National Socialism is primarily about philosophy. Talk about being a hammer and seeing every problem as a nail. Well, let me up the ante even further. I want also to suggest that the Nazi intellectuals and their followers thought of themselves as idealists, as crusaders for a noble cause. Now this may be even harder to swallow. The National Socialists of the 1920s were passionate men and women who thought that the world was in a crisis and that a moral revolution was called for. They believed their ideas to be true, beautiful, noble, and the only hope for the world. Yes, Nazi ideology contains major elements of harshness and brutality, but what if an important truth about the world is that it is harsh and brutal? It may be hard to believe that the Nazis thought of themselves as noble idealists, especially with our after-the-fact knowledge of the horrible destructiveness of Nazism. It may be even harder for those of us raised in Western liberal democracies to believe it, since from the cradle we've been raised to believe that freedom, equality, and peace are almost self-evidently good. But what if they aren't self-evidently good? Let me play devil's advocate for a moment here. For how long have human beings existed? Most anthropologists will say that Homo sapiens has been around for over 100,000 years. For how much of that time have freedom, equality, and peace been the norm? In classical Greece, democratic experiments were tried for a few centuries. A little later, the Roman Republic experimented with republican institutions, again for a few centuries. But both Greece and Rome failed. The Greeks were conquered by the Romans, and the Romans then slipped into authoritarian decadence before themselves being conquered. Two short-lived experiments in 100,000 years. Not very impressive. So now we imagine ourselves in Europe in the earliest decades of the 20th century. Democratic republicanism has been resurrected and is being tried again, for example, in the United States. But how successful have the modern experiments been? Come the 1920s, the United States is only about 150 years old, which means it has survived for less time than either the Greek democracies or the Roman Republic. The United States lasted only 90 years before plunging itself into a brutal civil war, the reverberations of which are still being felt in the 20th century. In the 1920s, the U.S. is itself experiencing economic uncertainty and is shortly to plunge into its Great Depression. Even in the U.S., many intellectuals are suggesting that capitalism and democracy are finished, and some form of centralized authority led by a strong man is the wave of the future. So, come the 1920s, just how strong is the case for capitalism, liberalism, democracy, republicanism? What if a culture's brightest intellectuals believe that democracy is a historical blip? What if they believe that the lesson of history is that what people need is structure and strong leadership? What if they think that history shows that some cultures are obviously superior to others, superior in their arts, their science and technology, their religion? What if they believe that history shows that we live in a harsh world of conflict, and that in such a world, strength and assertiveness against your enemies are necessary to survive? Or even more strongly than that peace makes a people soft, and that by contrast, it is conflict and war that brings out the best in people, making them tough and vigorous and willing to fight for their ideals and, if necessary, die for them. I'm suggesting that a set of ideals was primarily responsible for the rise of Nazism. I think those ideals are extraordinarily false and terribly destructive, but that is not how millions of educated, intelligent, and in many cases well-meaning Germans saw them. But why do I call them a set of ideals? Why not just say the Nazis had some ideas? Of course they had some ideas with which to bewitch the masses, but basically they just wanted power and were effective at using those ideas to get power. Well, of course the Nazis wanted power. What politician doesn't want power? But if you're just out for power, think about how you go about getting it in a democracy. The best way is to identify the established political parties, join one of the more powerful ones, and work your way up the ranks to the top. Here's an analogy. In the United States, the two major parties are the Democratic and Republican parties. So if you're young and ambitious and you want a realistic chance of becoming senator or even president in your lifetime, you join one of those two parties. What you do not do is join a fringe party. What you do not do is start your own party out in the middle of nowhere, say the Midwestern Farmers Union Party. The only reason you would start the Midwestern Farmers Union Party is if you were a true believer in the ideals of Midwestern farming and thought you could not achieve your ideals by joining with one of the established parties. But that describes the Nazis exactly. They did not join the Social Democrats or any of the established political parties. They set up their own fringe party in the south of Germany and away from the centers of power in Berlin. They were true believers in a cause. They did not want power if it meant compromising their ideals by joining with an established political party. They wanted power, but power to achieve what they took to be high ideals. So what was this obscure political party formed in Munich in 1920, and what did it stand for? The Nazi Party grew out of the DAP, the German Workers' Party. The goal of the party, according to one of its founders, Gottfried Feder, was to reconcile nationalism and socialism. It was a lecture by Gottfried Feder in 1919 that attracted Adolf Hitler to the party. Yet within a year, the party changed its name in order to have a name that more accurately expressed its core political principles. The new name of the party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At a rally in Munich in 1920, with over 2,000 participants, the party announced its new platform, a 25-point program. The main authors of the program were Hitler, Feder, and a third man named Anton Drexler. To understand what National Socialism stood for, the main points of the program are worth a closer look. A major theme of the program is a stress upon collectivism and a rejection of individualism. Point number 10 of the program, for example, says that it must be the first duty of every citizen to perform mental or physical work. Individual activity must not violate the general interest, but must be exercised within the framework of the community and for the general good. National Socialism thus consciously rejects Western liberal individualism with its rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all of which are individualistic. Nazism is collectivistic. It does not hold that individuals have their own lives to live and happinesses to pursue. Rather, individuals should work for the good of the community out of a sense of duty. Individuals should serve the general good, to which they subordinate their personal lives. Point number 24 returns to this theme and emphasizes it strongly. The common interest before self-interest. The bold print and the capitalization is in the original for emphasis. A second major theme of the Nazi program is a stress upon socialism and a strong rejection of capitalism. Numerically, socialism is the most emphasized part of the Nazi program. For over half of its 25 themes, 14 out of the 25 to be exact, itemize economically socialist demands. Point number 11 calls for the abolition of all income gained by loaning money at interest. Point number 12 demands the confiscation of all profits earned by German businesses during World War I. Point 13 demands the nationalization of all corporations. Point 14 demands the profit sharing in large industrial enterprises. Point 15 demands the generous development of state-run old age insurance. Point 16 calls for the immediate socialization of the huge department stores. And so on. So strong was the party's commitment to socialism that in 1921 it entered into negotiations to merge with another socialist party, the German Socialist Party. The negotiations fell through, but a commitment to economic socialism remained a key Nazi theme through the 1920s. For example, here is Adolf Hitler in a speech in 1927. We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance, and we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions. Even more strongly than Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels hated capitalism and urged socialism. Dr. Joseph Goebbels was perhaps the most brilliant and educated of all of the Nazi politicians, and when the Nazis came to power, he was to become one of the most powerful of the very top Nazis, perhaps number 2 or 3 behind Hitler himself. But Goebbels' commitment to National Socialist principles began much earlier. He received a wide-ranging classical education from 5 universities in Germany before receiving his Ph.D. degree from Heidelberg University in 1921. During his graduate student days, he absorbed and agreed with much of the writings of communists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Damning those he called, quote, the money pigs of capitalist democracy, unquote, Goebbels in speeches and pamphlets regularly declaimed that, quote, money has made slaves of us, unquote. Money, he argued, is the curse of mankind. It smothers the seed of everything great and good. Every penny is sticky with sweat and blood. And in language that could be right out of the writings of Karl Marx, Goebbels believed fervently, the worker in a capitalist state, and that is his deepest misfortune, is no longer a living human being, a creator, a maker. He has become a machine, a number, a cog in the machine without sense or understanding. He is alienated from what he produces. The Nazi solution, then, is strong socialism. The state should control the economy, organizing production and distribution in the collective interest. But this raises a question. So far, the Nazi program has emphasized that collectivism and socialism take precedence over the individual, but what collective social grouping takes precedence? Here, the Nazis emphatically define their collectivism in terms of nationalism. Individuals belong primarily to racial and ethnic groups, and it's their racial and ethnic groups that give them their core identities. In the Nazi program, 7 out of the 25 points speak directly to this issue. The issue is a little complicated here because the Nazis have 3 enemies in mind whom they are careful to distinguish themselves from. First, they reject Marxist socialism, or any socialism that puts economic groupings first. As much as the Nazis hate capitalism, they do not see the world as a battle between economic interests. To them, the Marxists are too narrowly focused on money. But money is only part of the real battle. The real battle is between different biological and cultural groups, groups with different languages, religions, values, laws, histories. For them, the battle is between Germans with their particular biological and cultural inheritance against all of the other racial cultures of the world. Second, the Nazis reject cosmopolitanism, an ideal of Western liberals who believe that human beings are essentially the same the world over, and who think that one should strive to be a citizen of the world, at home anywhere your travels might take you. The Nazis are nationalists, and they reject any form of internationalism or cosmopolitanism. These themes explain why the Nazis designed the swastika flag as they did, as a symbolic integration of socialism and nationalism. Red is symbolic of socialism, white is symbolic of nationalism, and the swastika symbol itself, according to Hitler, is symbolic of the Aryan struggle for supremacy against a world that is trying to destroy the Germans. And so in the Nazi program of 1920, we have several points about German national identity and asserting German needs and goals. Point 1 demands the unification of all ethnic Germans into a greater Germany. Point 8 demands that immigration by non-Germans be halted and that all those who have immigrated recently be expelled from the country. Public offices can be open only to citizens, and point 3 defines citizenship in terms of the possession of German blood. And the possession of German blood is defined carefully to eliminate a third target of the Nazis, those whom they hate even more than the Marxists or the liberal capitalists, and that is the Jews. Point 3 of the program denies that Jews can be racial comrades of the Germans, and this point, in combination with the other points, effectively shuts the Jews out of German life. In this poster, we can see the 3 heads of the dragon: the communist, the international capitalist, and the Jew, the enemies the pure German warrior must defeat. From the beginning of the party in 1920, the strong German nationalism and anti-Semitism are, like the collectivism and the socialism, core Nazi themes. While the 1920 program mentions the Jews only twice and seems to recommend only that the Jews be forced to leave Germany, within a few years the Nazi leadership has decided upon harsher measures. In 1925, for example, Hitler published Mein Kampf, a book that sold increasingly well as the Nazis rose to power. On page 471, we find an ambiguous statement to the effect that the Nazis' goal should be, quote, the total removal of the Jews, unquote. But a little later in the book, Hitler has eliminated all ambiguity and called for genocide. Quote, we must exterminate the Jews, unquote. So far, the Nazi program has 3 major themes: collectivism, socialism, nationalism. The next question is, how do the Nazis think this is to be achieved? As early as 1920s, the Nazis made it very clear that they are no friends of liberalism, democracy, or republicanism. They favor strong authoritarianism and centralized power. Point 23 calls for censorship and government control of all newspapers. Point 24 suggests limitations on religions that do not fit the Nazis' goals. Point 25 calls for centralization and unconditional power. Quote, we demand the creation of a strong central power in Germany. A central political parliament should possess unconditional authority over the entire Reich and its organization in general. Unquote. These points, in combination with the economic socialist points earlier, give the government complete control over all aspects of society. All through the 1920s, the Nazis are unapologetic about wanting to eliminate democracy, liberalism, and republicanism. Goebbels, for example, put it bluntly and publicly. Never do the people rule themselves. This madness has been invented by liberalism. Behind its concept of the sovereignty of the people hide the most corrupt rogues who do not want to be recognized. So, he continues, We shall create a power group with which we can conquer this state, and then ruthlessly and brutally, using the state's prerogatives, we shall enforce our will and our program. And again from Goebbels, history has seen repeatedly how a young, determined minority has overthrown the rule of a corrupt and rotten majority, and then used for a time the state and its means of power in order to bring about by dictatorship and force the conditions necessary to complete the conquest and to impose new ideas. So the Nazis were very clear from the outset what they were in favor of, what they were opposed to, and how they planned to exercise power once they achieved it. Socialism, nationalism, racial identity and purification, and a strong centralized government to make it happen. It is important to emphasize again that the Nazis put their program forward forthrightly and as a noble, even spiritual ideal to achieve. They promised not merely another political platform, but a whole philosophy of life that they and their followers believed promised renewal. And they called upon the Germans to exercise the highest spirit of altruism and self-sacrifice for the good of the community to make that renewal possible. Program point number 10 urges individuals to put the common interest before their self-interest. Point number 24 repeats it. Hitler and Goebbels repeatedly urged Nazism as a noble and spiritual ideal vision in contrast to the usual power-grubbing politics of the day. In Mein Kampf, Hitler insists, all force which does not spring from a firm spiritual foundation will be hesitating and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest on a fanatical view of life. He calls upon individuals not to be selfish, but to be willing to sacrifice. The preservation of the existence of a species presupposes a spirit of sacrifice in the individual. In Goebbels' autobiographical novel, Michael, a work that sold out of 17 editions, the lead character is explicitly likened to Jesus Christ. Michael is the Christ socialist who sacrifices himself out of a love of mankind. And Goebbels urges that Germans be willing to do the same for the greater good. Returning to this poster, note in the background the religiously spiritual figure with his arm encircling the young German soldier. Hitler regularly praises Germans for their spirit of altruism. This state of mind, which subordinates the interests of the ego to the conservation of the community, is really the first premise for every truly human civilization. Altruism, he thinks, is a character trait more pronounced in Germans than in any other culture, which is why he claimed to be so optimistic about Germany's future. This message of National Socialism as a moral ideal and a spiritual crusade was appealing to many, many Germans, and especially among the young. By 1925, for example, 2/3 of the Nazi Party membership in the north of Germany is young, under 30 years of age. And within a very few years, the Nazis will have attracted a large following among university students. And Goebbels especially calls out to the idealistic young to be the heart of the Nazi future in Germany. The old ones don't even want to understand that we young people even exist. They defend their power to the last. But one day they will be defeated after all. Youth finally must be victorious. We young ones, we shall attack. The attacker is always stronger than the defender. If we free ourselves, we can also liberate the whole working class. And the liberated working class will release the fatherland from its chains. For the Nazis, the clear, firm, and passionate advocacy of their political ideals, along with efficient organization and propaganda, brought them increasing democratic success in Germany. After years of work, by 1928 the party had only 12 seats in the Reichstag, Germany's national parliament. But in the election of September 1930, they increased that number to 107 seats. Less than 2 years later, in the election of July 1932, they increased that number dramatically to 230 seats. A few months later, they lost 34 seats in a November election and now had 196. But in January of 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor, one of the two highest offices in the land, and the Nazis are now in a position to consolidate their power. In March of 1933, they call yet another election in order to get a clear mandate from the German people about their plans for Germany. The election has a huge turnout, and the Nazis score huge gains, winning 43.9% of the popular vote and 288 seats in the Reichstag. 288 seats is more seats than their next three competitors combined.